Here's the overview I want you to pay attention to. So I want you to look at the Form 2120 here. So this is actually about multiple support declaration. And you want to put your name. So here we're speaking about the name that you are showing on your return on your 1040. You got to put your social. And so it's one of those things where you have to be very specific. And you got to really, so this is a statement that says during the calendar year 2023, the eligible persons listed below each paid over 10% of the support of and then you have to put the name of your qualifying relative. So it's one of those things where it can be it can be your son, your daughter, your mother, your father. It really doesn't matter, okay? But you have to put the name of the qualifying relative. Now, I will explain later on what qualifying relative really means, so we have a clear idea about everything, okay? And then what you have to say is that you have to. So basically, you have to put at the bottom here all the people that are eligible. And so here you have, so the first person you have John Doe. I mean, you put the social security number, you put so for every eligible persons, you have to put the name, you got to put the address. One thing I want to say here is that when we talk about eligible persons, you basically have to make sure that there is a proper paper trail that actually that ties everything back to this form. In other words, if the IRS were to audit this form and ask for further information, you got to be able to provide all kinds of information. So one thing I want to say here is that, I mean, obviously for sake of simplicity, we just put the eligible person's name and also their address. But when you are filing actually a Form 2120, you have to attach an explanatory statement to this form. In other words, basically you have the form itself. So you're saying, hey, listen, here are the people who are actually related to this form. But you got to have a statement that explains everything. And because you have to contextualize, you have to actually explain to the IRS how this information relates to the people that you are actually listing here. But please make sure that what the IRS really pays attention a lot to the social security numbers. So make sure that those numbers are accurate and do not, because otherwise, if there is a mistake, they will audit the whole form, everybody on the form. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. Let's dig a little deeper here. Now, I want to talk to you about the approach here. So the thing is that when we talk about Form 1120, let's first explain everything so we have a clear idea what we're speaking about. So you can use Form 1120, not 1120, Form 2120, 1120 something else, Form 2120, to actually make a multiple support declaration for certain dependents if more than one person pays over 10% of the dependent's total support, but no one person pays more than 50%. And basically, support is defined as basic living expenses such as housing, utilities, foods, clothing, and other necessities. Now, depending on the person that you are actually supporting, there might be other expenses that actually creep in, okay? Now, the main purpose of a Form 2120 is to basically identify the person who will claim a dependent in the qualifying relative category to qualify for certain credits, such as the credits for other dependents, when no one person named on the form provides more than half of the dependent's support. So filing Form 2120 allows all but one of the people who support the dependent to waive their rights to claim that person as a dependent. So it's one of those things where you got to see whether or not it works for you or doesn't. And it's also important, it's also part of your tax preparation strategy. So while the dependent exemptions have been eliminated for the 2018 to 2025 tax years, there are other tax benefits of claiming a dependent, including the Child and Dependent Care Credit, so the CDCC, and the ability to claim a dependent's medical and educational expenses, especially if your tax situation is in such a way that you would need to actually get that. I mean, you might need to have to claim medical and educational expenses to actually reduce your tax liability. And each individual listed on Form 2120 may claim any medical expenses they paid for the dependent each year. So this is totally possible. It's one of those things where, again, anything you claim on this form, you got to have proper documentation to substantiate it, especially in case like if the amounts are kind of high, then you need to have more documentation. Very important. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 2120. Now let's talk about the reasons here. Why file Form 2120? Well, the thing is that individuals over 18 who are not full-time students or permanently and totally disabled may receive support from multiple people as a qualifying relative. Okay, and so it may be necessary to file a multiple support declaration to determine who is eligible to claim that person as a dependent. It's all about allocating expenses when you really think about it. And many times in extended family and community relationships, an individual may receive significant support from someone unrelated to them or related but not a parent really. When the individual receiving support is a parent or other relative, they do not have to live with the individuals providing their support. So let's quickly talk about qualifying child versus qualifying relative dependents. So you can't use Form 2120 for multiple people who want to claim the same dependent child. So a qualifying child must be under 19, 24 if a full-time student, no age limit if permanently and totally disabled. And a qualifying child must be younger than you, so you are the one filing, so he or she must be younger than you. A qualifying child must live with you for more than half a year, so we're speaking here about at least 6 months. A qualifying child must not have provided more than half of their own support for the year. And a qualifying child must be your child by birth or adoption, stepchild, foster child, sibling, half sibling, step sibling, or any descendant, for example, grandchild, niece, or nephew, but not cousin. And since the support rule for a qualifying child requires the child not to provide more than half their own support, Form 2120 is not permitted for a qualifying child. It's one of those things where you have to really, again, rules revolve around the 50% threshold. And again, when you actually, for you to justify that, you got to have proper documentation. That's what I was just talking to about earlier when I said that everything revolves around maintaining a proper paper trail. And you want to have that so that, if the IRS were to ask you any questions, you are able to justify whatever you claim on Form 2120. And I want to talk to you. So I spoke to you about what a qualifying child must actually be to be valid. Let's talk about a qualifying relative, because there are cases where you can either have you can have qualifying children or qualifying relatives. So a qualifying relative can be related to you in one of the ways defined earlier, but does not need to be younger than you or in the age brackets outlined. So basically, a qualifying relative can be your granddad, can be your grandmom, can be your aunt, your niece, your nephew, your uncle, anything. Okay, and a qualifying relative does not have it to be related to you, such as a friend or significant other who is not your spouse or other relative. A qualifying relative must have less than $4,700 in gross income for 2023. So for this year is $4,700. And a qualifying relative must receive more than half of their total support from you or the group of individuals who paid more than 10% of their support. And so a qualifying relative needs to live with you for the entire year in the same household unless they are related to you in any of the following ways. So child, stepchild, foster child, or descendants, for example, grandchild, sibling, half sibling, or step sibling, parents, step parents, grandparents, or other direct ancestors except foster parents, niece or nephew, including those of half siblings, aunts and uncles, and in-laws. Now, the rules are pretty simple in terms of qualifying relatives versus qualified children. The only thing is you have to understand, going back to what I said earlier, please make sure that you have you can maintain a proper paper trail no matter what, because it's one of those things where when it comes to justifying some kind of multiple allocation of expenses, you want to actually justify things a lot. And it's one of those things where electronic documents or electronic statements might not be enough. So, credit card statements or bank statements might not be enough. In some cases, just a lot better to have a statement from the service provider, a receipt from the service provider, a bill, for instance, to sort of justify the expenses you're claiming. Okay, very important when it comes to that. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 2120. Let's talk about how to fill out Form 2120. And so if you are claiming the dependent on your tax return, you want to enter your name and social security number at the top of Form 2120. It's one of those things where, again, it's make sure that the numbers that you're putting here are pretty accurate. And so below that, you have to enter the tax year in question and the dependent's name. It's one of those things where when we talk about Form 2120, remember that you can name up to 4 people on that form if each person contributes more than 10% of the dependent's total support and could potentially claim the dependent. If there are more than 4 people who could claim the dependents, you want to attach an additional statement, and you want to enter each eligible person's name, address, and most importantly, their social security number. And you want to file Form 2120 with your tax return in the year that you are claiming this person as a dependent. One thing I want to say here is that it's one of those things where you have to again be clear when you file your Form 1040. You got to have a clear idea what kind of expenses you are claiming as related to Form 2120. Now, to name someone as a potential dependent, you must have a signed statement from each person named in the form indicating their agreement to waive claiming the dependent for the calendar year in question. This happens on a year-by-year basis, though. I mean, so this year you can actually waive your rights to claim that dependence, and next year you can say, you know what, I want to claim that dependent, and the year after you can actually claim it again, or you can waive it. So it's really something to have that actually you have to negotiate on a year-by-year basis. Do not file this statement with your tax return, though. You want to keep it in your records. I'm talking about the statement from each person named in the form indicating their agreement to waive claiming the dependent for the calendar year in question. Okay, and you just keep it. That'll be part of your records. I think the best way is just to keep an electronic version of it, just in case something were to happen to the actual paper. It's just better that you can go back to your email, or you can go back to your hard drive or to your USB key and retrieve that statement should something happen, should the IRS ask, for example. I want to give you other requirements that's very important. I mean, when we talk about Form 2120, it's all about the proportion of expenses that you provided to that dependent throughout the year. And that proportion really has to be clear in terms of not only the paper trail that you have kept, but also the paper trail that the dependent has kept if he or she is in a position to keep a paper trail. In other words, if the IRS were to audit you, sometimes what they do is they cross-reference the data that you're providing them with the data that the dependent himself or herself is also giving the agency. Okay, so remember that to claim someone as a dependent with Form 2120, you need to have paid at least 10% of the cost of support. 10% is actually the minimum here. And further, no single person listed on the form can have paid more than 50% of the cost of support. So when those two rules are sort of satisfied, then we are good to go. So you want to attach your Form 2120 to your Form 1040, but do not include the signed statements, okay? Those statements, as I said earlier, they are just for your records. So it's one of those things where you might be ready to produce them if necessary. One thing I also want to say here is that it's important to actually file your own taxes. I mean, so when you file, or when we talk about filing Form 2120, this is part of filing your Form 1040, and you do not have to file Form 2120 separately. You can actually use any regular tax software such as a TurboTax or Jackson Hewitt or H&R Block or Tax Act or Tax Layer. And when you file, when they go through the series of questions and answers, they will ask you questions that revolve around Form 2120. So when you provide those answers, you will basically get all, like, the tax software will automatically prepare the Form 2120 in the background. So when you file Form 1040, it will be attached to it. It will be an ancillary, ancillary schedule that goes with Form 1040. So you have a clear idea that you are in compliance at all times with rules and regulations here that revolve around claiming a dependent on your tax return. One thing I need to say is that please make sure that you actually have received a clear and written statement from all the other people who could claim this dependent. Let me give you a few pro tips before we close to this conversation. When we talk about Form 2120, again, everything revolves around claiming a dependent. And it's one of those things where you have to really be clear that not only the person that you're claiming is okay with it, and all the other people who are claiming, who could claim this relative, are also okay with that. Now, claiming someone as a dependent on your tax return generally reduces your taxes, right? This is why every taxpayer wants to do it, but to do it, you gotta be able to substantiate anything around that sort of dependent claiming process. So to claim someone besides a child as a dependent, though, certain conditions have to be met. So the person has to either live with you all year or be on the IRS list of relatives who do not have to live with you to be your dependent. So this includes parents, siblings, nieces and nephews, and others. This person cannot earn more than $4,700 for 2023. This limit increases to $5,050 for 2024. And you actually have to pay more than half the cost of supporting the person. Okay, and so there are cases where basically costs may be shared. So when costs are shared, in some cases, the taxpayer situation may meet all the conditions for claiming someone as a dependent, except for the last one, providing more than half of the support. For example, a group of siblings might all chip in to pay the cost of supporting an aging parent, and one daughter might bear the bulk of the responsibility for dad, including having him living in her home, but she cannot claim him as a dependent because she doesn't pay the majority of the cost herself. So that's where Form 2120 comes in. And it's one of those things where, again, as you can see, situations can be pretty intricate, right? You want to have proper documentation. Going back to what I said about having documentation, you got to have proper agreements. And those agreements must be written so that everything is clear to everybody. You never know. Do not accept verbal agreements because people can change their minds all the time. You never know. But if you are able to have someone actually work with you, and let's say a family member or a relative who agrees to a specific situation and they put it in writing, then you are good to go because those written statements can be enforced in a court of law. Should problems arise and should misunderstandings arise, you are able to look at the written statements and actually provide evidence that, hey, listen, I'm doing things according to the plan that we signed ourselves. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Let's quickly do a recap here. So in today's conversation, I gave you the overview, the approach, the steps, and finally the pro tips. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.